The race for president is over. For the first time in history, a black man, Mays Gilliam, will be the next president of the United States of America.
Beginning with the candidate, we've generally picked movies that have reflected America's rightward shift over the last 50 years. These films, Bob Roberts, Wag the Dog, Bulworth, and Election, have all been satires, black comedies that dealt with the political situation, mainly during the Clinton era. It's nice to end this month on a much more lighthearted note. Tonight we are talking about Chris Rock's 2003 Head of State, about an alderman called Mays Gilliam, who surprisingly becomes America's first black president. In some ways, this is the movie that most harkens back to something like Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, although for a much more cynical generation. After the Democratic presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate die in a plane crash, the diabolical senator, Bill Arno, wants to find someone to lose the 2004 presidential election to Vice President Brian Lewis.
The minorities will be happy and they will vote for us in 2008 because we've shown we support them. And the white people will vote for us because our guy isn't black. You got my vote!
Arno plans to run in 2008. Ironically, the year we'd actually end up choosing a black president, but is looking to capture minority votes and a clear future path for himself in 2004 as a kingmaker. Where I think this movie has a Capra-esque flair is that Mays Gilliam begins telling people simple truths and connecting with them, and that steadily earns him support. People are tired of the same old bullshit and negativity, as embodied by the Republican Vice President, Brian Lewis, and are fired up when Mays Gilliam talks to them about bread and butter economic issues. Like being broke, even after working 2 jobs, working paycheck to paycheck, the failing education system, and rising crime rate.
But there's nothing wrong with being an amateur. The people that started the Underground Railroad were amateur. Martin Luther King was an amateur.
This is embodied in Mays Gilliam's chosen slogan, "That ain't right."
Now, if your child's school has old-ass books and brand-new metal detectors, let me hear you say, that ain't right.
That ain't right.
It ain't right. And now we got these corporations stealing all the money. They stealing their money, they stealing our money. The pension.
Of course, this movie is very much a product of the Bush administration and the war on terror.
Of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine.
One pretty amazing bit is that when Mays Gilliam decides to go negative, his ads have a clearly dubbed over Osama bin Laden endorsing Brian Lewis.
Yo, what's up? I'm Osama bin Laden. I hate America, but I love Brian Lewis.
Paid for by Osama bin Laden.
It was at this time in American history that both mainstream white culture and comedy itself began to go off the rails. The 9/11 terror attack and onslaught of rampant over-patriotic messaging in the lead-up to the war in Iraq seeped deeply into American culture. Shows like 24 pumped out pure Islamophobia, and even white comedians, embodied here by annoying puppet guy Jeff Dunham, dealt with the collective psychiatric damage from the first attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor through flag-waving jingoism.
That's affirmative. Start with the older son, Assad. If that's not successful, move on to his youngest son.
Copy that. Waiting for your order.
We are a go.
However, this definitely opened up space for black comedy to flourish during the Bush administration. Whether it's Chris Rock's ability to make a movie like this, or Chappelle's show doing the Black Bush sketch, black culture, after undergoing so much trauma throughout the 20th century, often seemed far more grounded in the early 2000s.
The nigga bought aluminum tubes. Do I need to tell you what the you can do with an aluminum tube? Aluminum! That don't scare you? Fine. I didn't even want to say this. The mother bought some yellow cake, okay, in Africa. He went to Africa and he bought yellow cake.
Are you sure?
Yes, I'm sure, bitch!
Head of State is one of a handful of movies to be blessed with the talent of Bernie Mac before his untimely death in 2008. Bernie Mac plays Mitch Gilliam, May's older brother and vice presidential candidate. As is fitting, Bernie Mac gets some of the funniest lines in the movie, including a pretty great back and forth on NATO.
What about NATO? How do you feel about NATO?
I never met NATO. I never met NATO. I don't know nothing about it. I don't talk about people behind their back.
NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Oh, you didn't say that. I thought you were talking about the guy. I know this guy named NATO Jacobs.
Well, you have to know these things if you're running for public
office. Do you know
office.
NATO Jacobs?
Tracy Morgan also appears throughout the movie as a dancing meat salesman.
More beef than East Coast, West Coast rap. Check it out. Hey, shoot my man! Saving lives and stuff. Why don't you cop one of these pork chops,
Of course, the premise at the heart of the movie is about the first black president, and that's captured in a pretty heartfelt speech that Chris Rock gives right before the election.
You just represent yourself. Me? I represent my whole race. Yeah, if I quit, there won't be another black candidate for 50 years.
Chris Rock has said that the inspiration for Head of State came from Walter Mondale's choice of Geraldine Ferraro as vice president. Knowing he'd likely lose to Reagan no matter what, Mondale chose to nominate a woman. In 2008, just 5 years later, America would elect its first black president. Of course, he wasn't assassinated, and there wasn't some great upset, which makes Head of State an interesting visionary artifact of its time.
But I tell you what, you won't see me moving to no African jungle anytime soon. Or some goddamn desert somewhere sitting on a carpet with a bunch of Arabs. No, sir. And you won't see me stop eating no ribs either. You gotta have them ribs. And pussy too. Don't Malcolm talk about no pussy? Now you know that ain't gonna work.